Third case study is the Bhopal gas disaster in 1984. Just as Love Canal was sort of exiting the world's newspapers and people were beginning to forget about it, we had a new disaster, disaster of the month, disaster of the year, whatever you want to call it, Bhopal gas disaster in 1984, that involved an American subsidiary of Union Carbide, that is to say, an Indian subsidiary of Union Carbide, that produced chemicals for chemical fertilizers to end famine in India, blew up. And as a result of that, tens of thousands of people suffered a horrific death because of the toxic miasma, the cloud that descended over the illegal slums that had built up around the factory. Now you might detect a familiar sort of refrain or story here. The corporation, the Indian government, all those involved and responsible for the disaster refused to accept any responsibility for the suffering. The victims, of course, were outraged and demanded compensation, and there began a decades-long political struggle, which, by the way, is continuing to this day, to get compensation and to clean up the site where this disaster had occurred in central India in the city of Bhopal, which I visited in order to conduct research for this book, just as I had visited and lived near Love Canal to conduct research for that particular case study. More images from the Bhopal disaster. This is one of the images shows you some of the dead bodies that had emerged after the disaster. And then we see another image of the chemical plant today, which I also visited when I did research for the book in 2007. Finally, we leave the course with a bang rather than a whimper when Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union, blows up April 26, 1986. One of the points that I want you to think about with regard to the Chernobyl case study, which is true of the other case studies as well, is that more than a power plant blew up when the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl blew up. The Soviet Union told the world that unlike the United States, we know how to manage nuclear power successfully. Unlike the United States, which dropped bombs on people with nuclear technology, we use nuclear technology to make the world a better place. And we know how to manage it successfully. Our civilization, our utopia, is going to be based on free electricity, scientists providing the expertise, just like I talked about earlier with regard to Francis Bacon and his idea of a new Atlantis. The scientists would provide the expertise. The politicians would apply this expertise to making life better. And of course, they would benefit from the political support and the accolades that would flow forth. So when Chernobyl blew up, much more than a power plant blew up. What also blew up was a whole political system based on the successful use of science and technology. Put another way, the Soviet Union required the successful management of science and technology to exist. Conversely, if science and technology were not properly managed, the very existence of the political system was put into doubt. To a certain degree, this is true in all the case studies that I look at, and this constitutes the political challenge of massive scientific and technological failure. And it raises the issue, is progress to die for? Literally. How much sacrifice is needed to build the better future? Are these accidents a sort of inevitable byproduct of progress, something we need to endure in order to get to the better future? That's often how they are represented. Accidents happen. You have to break eggs to make a few omelets, that kind of thing. Certain people will have to be sacrificed for the future. But is it to die for? Literally. It also raises the issue of, in the case of all these industrial accidents, what do we do with this crap that we produce? We could flush it away, out of sight, out of mind, but it goes into the environment and will impact us sooner or later. How do we manage the mountains, the millions of tons, the billions of tons of industrial excrement? Do we dump it? Do we bury it? Do we put it in the ocean? Do we build a fence around it? All these issues continue to loom large in modern civilization, and yet we really are uncomfortable talking about them. We prefer the metaphor of the toilet flush. Out of sight, out of mind, someone else's problem. The problem, though, is that they will impact the environment and affect us regardless of whether or not we forget about them. And I want to finally raise one last theme in this book, and that is a quote from a sociologist, French sociologist Henri Lefebvre, who said something really profound, at least for me, that I try to work with in the book, and that is that social relationships are latent in spaces. And what he meant by this was that you can begin to understand a society by looking at how people populate the environment, which kind of people do so. And that's an approach I use in all the case studies. So to give you an example, in the case of Love Canal, the people who were given compensation ultimately were white homeowners. In American society, white people who have money, who own a home, are the ones who deserve compensation. The people who did not receive compensation were black renters, people of race, who were renting. In the American calculus, to rent is to be a loser. To own is to be a winner. Well, you can see how economic power is associated also with the racial divide, so that white homeowners are privileged and black renters are not. So the outcome of the disaster, when people begin thinking about compensation, is privilege the white homeowners over the black renters. To take the case of India, the primary victims in India were Muslim. Muslims in India traditionally came from the lower caste, the untouchables. They converted to Islam, the promise that everyone could be equal, from Hinduism. And in India today, the sizable minority, 300 million or so, Muslims, are also the poorest people in India. They were the ones that were affected most by the toxic miasma that came out of the Bhopal power plant when it exploded, and it settled around the illegal slums that had built up around the factory. When the miasma, the toxic fog, moved, it dissipated before it actually affected the rich Hindu population that occupied the upper levels, the higher levels in the mountains around the lake in Bhopal. So you can see in India, the basic divide was between poor and Muslim, rich Hindu in the city of Bhopal. And the disaster affected people and had implications that tended to highlight those divisions and tensions within society. So that's what I mean when I cite Henri Lefebvre, that social relationships are latent in spaces. We can look at the spaces people inhabit and how they are affected by these disasters to gain insight into what it is that divides and unites these societies, more often divides them. Finally, the issue of gender and grassroots activism. You will see in each of these case studies that women play a prominent role as activists, which is very striking given the fact that women in all these societies tend to be discriminated against. And yet, during environmental disasters, women tend to play a very prominent role as defenders of the environment and of the community and of the home. Why that is, I think, is something that we should think about and discuss more deeply in this class, and we'll have occasion to think about that in some of the discussion boards surrounding the chapters that we're looking at in my book, Perils of Progress. Okay, finally, when you read the conclusion, there are a number of issues I want you to think about. I'll just mention these to plant a seed in your brain without going into great detail. The question of evil intent versus inadvertent evil. What I mean here is that these are all accidents. No one intended that they happen. And yet you will see in each case study that people want to blame someone for deliberately causing all the suffering that results from these acts. In other words, people have difficulty accepting the fact that you can have so much pain and suffering and have it be an accident. It has to be deliberate. There has to be some Hitler-like figure who is deliberately conducting some genocidal policy. That's a tendency you see among many people when they look at disasters like this. From an historian's point of view, however, that way of thinking is completely wrong. They were accidents. They weren't deliberately caused. The techie fuzzy divide that I talked about earlier. When these disasters occur, very often you have scientists or engineers who get up and begin proclaiming, this is the impact it's going to have on you. Here are the processes that occurred, and they use a language that most people can't understand. So the techie fuzzy divide that I discussed earlier in this course becomes really evident when the proverbial stuff hits the fan and technology and science fails in dramatic ways that impact millions of people. At that point, the inability of scientists and engineers to communicate becomes a huge political liability and problem that exacerbates tensions and causes the disaster to be even worse. Finally, this idea of normal accidents in the absence of a disaster imagination. From my perspective as an historian, large-scale technological disasters are a normal feature of modern civilization. The curious thing is that we think of them as exceptional, as accidents that are exceptions to the norm. The extent to which we think of them as exceptional means that we don't prepare for them as something that could happen over and over again. And indeed, one of the lessons that I learned in each of these case studies is that societies don't examine these case studies in order to prevent them from happening again, precisely because they think that they are exceptional, and therefore chances are it won't happen again. A kind of sticking your head in the sand, ostrich-like approach. This is very common. So that's my presentation of the basic themes of the book Perils of Progress, a little bit about why I wrote it, and some ideas for you to chew on as you go through each of the case studies in each of the chapters.